watched the 2012 election knows that, the conditions are ripe going forward, policy and politics, for a return to the high-skilled immigration talk, not just because of H-1Bs and STEM education, but also because of this new interest in comprehensive immigration reform in both chambers of Congress and at the White House. So we've got a fantastic panel to talk about this morning, but before we get into the discussion, I want to introduce the Congresswoman next to me who's going to give a few remarks. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren was first elected to Congress in 1995, and she represents the 16th District of California. She's the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Immigration Subcommittee, and she serves on the Science Committee. And frankly, anybody in this room who's followed tech policy debates has probably interacted with a congresswoman as a veteran of the fights over things like patent reform and SOPA and, of course, immigration. So here to start us off and to give us the agenda and the good news for the rest of the year is Congresswoman Lofgren.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think before we discuss strategy, it's important to focus on our goals. And when it comes to immigration, why immigration is good for America. Just a few factoids. We have, in terms of startup companies, immigrants have founded 25% of all the engineering and technology startups in the United States, and 52% of the startups in Silicon Valley, my home. Among Fortune 500 companies, immigrants or their children founded more than 40% in 2010 of the Fortune 500 companies, employing more than 10 million people worldwide, generating $4.2 trillion in revenue annually, more than the GDP of every country in the world except the United States, China, and Japan. In terms of venture-funded companies, a recent report tells us that almost 50% of America's 50 top venture-funded companies were founded by immigrants, that key members of management or product development teams in these cutting-edge companies are about 75%, and immigrants created an average of approximately 150 jobs per company in the United States. There are high levels of entrepreneurship among immigrants. Immigrants are twice as likely to start businesses as people born in the United States. And immigrant businesses, including small non-tech businesses, have grown at 2.5 times the national average. We also know that immigrants are stars when it comes to STEM education. One recent study found that 96% of immigrants had STEM bachelor's degrees and 74% had advanced degrees. 53% of the immigrant founders of US-based technology and engineering companies received their degrees from US universities. In terms of STEM degrees, 50 to 64% of all PhDs awarded by US universities in certain STEM fields like physics, computer science, electrical engineering were immigrants. And immigrants are fueling innovation. So do we have a need for reform? Yes, we do, because right now, if you are, I often go to the Stanford graduation, my alma mater, and when you see the students ready to receive their diplomas, their PhDs and masters, most of them, a majority of them, are foreign students. And yet, they are not provided an easy path to stay in the United States, to take jobs, to start companies, and grow our economy. There's a 2-year wait for people with master's or doctoral degrees, and for some with bachelor's degrees in electrical engineering, for example, there can be a 4 to 70, that's 70-year wait, depending on what country you're for. This damages our economy. It's also true, however, we're here looking at technology for other parts of our economy. If you take a look at semi-skilled or skilled but not academic work, agriculture, we have about 2 million migrant farm workers in the United States. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of them are here without their immigration papers. And yet, if they were to leave, agriculture would collapse. On the family side, We have delays between 2 and 3 years for the spouses and minor children of lawful permanent residents. There can be 4 to 7 year waits for the adult children of American citizens, and up to 60-year wait for the siblings of U.S. citizens. The whole system needs reform. Now, last year, I introduced a bill called the IDEA Act that I worked on very hard. I talked to everybody from the IEEE that heartily endorses it, the biggest engineering society in the world, to technology companies and venture capitalists, and we basically came up with a bill that everyone supports. I am hopeful that we will be able to make that bill a part of a comprehensive bill this Congress. And why do I think a comprehensive bill is possible after we have been deadlocked on immigration for so many years? I just think back to November, the election. Governor Romney was defeated substantially. And the electorate in certain demographic groups spoke very loudly. He got less than 30% of the vote among Asian voters. He got less than 30% of the vote among Latino voters. And there are serious Republican leaders who realize that unless they are able to have a better chance to talk to these growing demographic groups, they will not, again, have a Republican president of the United States. And so there is tremendous motivation on the part of Republicans to get right with immigration. The good news is that Democrats want to as well. We'll be happy to compete on other issues with these growing demographic groups. And so we have a window of opportunity to make sure that we solve the immigration mess. It needs reform from top to bottom, that we do it in a bipartisan and methodical way. And I am hopeful with conservatives like Sean Hannity and Charles Krauthammer and Speaker John Boehner saying it's time for comprehensive reform, that we will have a window of opportunity to move forward to do that. So I look forward to the panel today, and also, I don't know if we have a Q&A, but to that as well if we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Congresswoman. And yeah, we're definitely going to have a discussion, and we're going to open it up to audience questions in a little bit. But first, I want to introduce the rest of our panel and actually start talking about some of these issues. So, you know, the others on the panel, that's Jeremy Robbins, Policy Advisor and Special Counsel for Mayor Bloomberg. Fabian Becker is co-founder of Morpheus Medical, and Vish Chatterjee, Director of Product Innovation at Universal Electronics. Guys, I'd love to go down the line and get your reaction to some of the things that the Congresswoman had said. You know, what do you think as we enter this year? Do we have the political momentum, and how do we execute on something that tech companies have been talking about for quite some time?
Sure. Thank you, Tony. And it's a pleasure to be here and share the stage with leaders in the tech industry, and especially with Congresswoman Lofgren, who has been very much the leader on this issue in Congress and continues to lead on the issue. And I would just say quickly that I couldn't agree more about both the political and economic case. For the political case, there's never been a stronger demographic argument about why we need reform. The problem is that the electoral math is still very, very difficult. To get to 60 votes in the Senate and to get to a majority in the House, there's going to need to be a lot of pressure. There's going to need to be a lot of movement among leaders, but among people in the public, among businesses, and to really educate about the economic message, because it's not just about, well, here's an immigrant and they studied at a university and now they can't get a job, and that's a shame. That is a shame. But it's also a shame for the American economy, because this is very much about our economic growth. It's very much about American jobs, and it's very much about competitiveness. So just to add a few more statistics onto things that she said, STEM is exploding in this country. STEM jobs have grown 3 times faster than the rest of the economy over the last 10 years. That can continue to outpace the economy. And that's a great thing for America because it makes us more competitive. It helps us innovate. The problem is that we're not producing enough American STEM grads to meet that. So if you look right now in the economy, there are 3.5 applicants for every job opening that's out there. That's a terrible thing. That's why we're having trouble getting out of the recession. But in STEM, it's the reverse. There are twice as many job openings as applicants. quarter of science and engineering firms are already reporting difficulty hiring, and it's going to get worse because right now, the number of Americans studying STEM is increasing at less than 1% a year. So you have this explosion in supply of jobs, but you don't have this explosion in the number of people to fill them. And there are two obvious answers to that. One is, of course, education, that we need to fix our STEM pipeline and educate more Americans to do it, but that's a long-term and very difficult process. So while we do that, we have this huge pool of very talented, motivated people, many of whom we are paying to train in our universities, or at least funding their research, and we're sending them abroad, and that's a huge cost to the economy. So even if you just look at the basic research going on in the US universities, more than 3 out of every 4 patents our top schools are receiving have immigrant inventors. So this is about being competitive. It's about American jobs, and we need to help educate Congress about that. So I welcome the thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for giving me the chance to be there with Congress. I love Gren, and thank you to the CEA as well. I'm one of those cases. So I came to Stanford to learn business, and I discovered I wanted to do something meaningful. And during my time at Stanford, we learned about the problem that there is in cardiac space when 1% of every newborn have heart defects. Nobody really knows about it, and it's really underknown and underdiagnosed and undertreated. And a lot of people have heart disease, actually, most of the time. It's the #1 cause of morbidity. And so at Stanford, we found this amazing technology that can basically change that paradigm, can see the heart in a way that has never been seen under 10 minutes with no radiation, in a way like your chest is transparent. It's really amazing. So we basically created a company called Morpheus with 3 other persons from Stanford on medical and engineering side, and we want to really bring that meaningful, important technology to market. And we got my visa, and I was, of course, like we had raised almost $2 million, and it was all contingent upon the fact that I got a visa and a work immigration status. And the term was led by Jerry Yang, which you can imagine how amazing it was. And it took me like several months and 3 attempts to get my visa in place. Actually, the last day, I got it, and the next day I would have had to be deported and leave the country, and the term would have died, and I would have left the country, and probably the company would have died with me as well. So I think my story is just a way to explain and try to be an example of try to avoid that for the future. I think I came to America with a desire to create meaningful organization that can have impact. And there's a lot of many other people like me. And I think if one thing in an economical situation, what you cannot avoid is avoid talents. And you want talents, and you want to favor initiatives. And we come with that in energy and the desire to create that, which was the founding reason why this country was created as well. And today there's a disconnect between how the country is welcoming us and the desire that we have to build meaningful things. And I really think that the bill that we've been trying to push with CA and Congresswomen and other people try to change that reform to avoid the painful process I had to go through for me, but for the other people trying to help through Morpheus will really happen. Thank you.
I'm really pleased to be on this panel as well. Thank you for having me, guys. So from my perspective, I think the concept of immigration, where people talk about immigration, I'm not sure what image comes to mind. And that might be part of the concern is when we talk about immigration in public sphere, is it related to porous borders? Is it related to the issues we have with our neighboring countries? Or is it really related to the kind of things we're struggling with in tech industry? And I think that when we tie immigration to economy and we tie immigration to global competitiveness of America in the global playing field, I think it becomes a much more relevant issue to everybody. I think that economy is obviously a hot button issue, and if the average person understood the relationship of immigration to economy for them and the relationship of strategic immigration to their own jobs, I think it would make a lot of sense. Because I think right now the issue is very simplified. It's, hey, if we allow immigrants to have jobs, then we take away an American job. But I think the equation should be, if we allow strategic immigration, we allow some of these educated, talented people to be successful here in the U.S. and allow them to grow companies, those companies in turn start hiring people that are Americans a lot of times. So I really feel that if we can somehow tie those issues together, it makes a lot more sense. In my case, I came here on a student visa for undergraduate education at Northwestern Mechanical Engineering, and I had a hard time getting a job out of school, and I wanted to start a company, and I couldn't. Without visa, without a path towards having a visa, I couldn't do that. So I basically, chose the opportunities I had based on which companies were willing to do that extra bit of paperwork to keep me on. And then over time, it's been about 13 years of a journey from an H-1 visa to a green card, to finally getting my citizenship just 2 months ago. So I really see that, it's such a long and difficult journey. I went through graduate school. I did my MBA at Michigan, and about 30% of my class were foreign students. And a lot of them ended up going back home because they had no path to stay here. They might have had startup ambitions, they had entrepreneurial ambitions, but they couldn't. I was lucky, I already had my green card at that point, so I had the freedom to choose opportunities that really made a difference. I ended up starting up a division at a company called Belkin that ended up employing 30 full-time heads at the end of it all. These are jobs that are created through an immigrant. So I think tying immigration to the economy and the effect on other people's jobs, I think might be a way to get some of that momentum going.
Sure. I want to take a step back for a second. One of the things that all of you seem to, you all generally seem to view high-skilled immigration, perhaps immigration reform more comprehensively in the same light. So let's take a step back. What we seem to be talking about is a workforce issue here in the United States. As you mentioned, there are, as Jeremy pointed out, there are more STEM jobs than there are applicants in the United States. Why aren't we having a conversation instead about improving U.S. education, spending more money to help students go to school to get those degrees here? That's going to be the one thing that we hear, if this debate potentially makes it onto Capitol Hill, starts to percolate a little bit more, why we're not spending on U.S. education. I'm putting that out there. Whoever wants to take it, Congresswoman.
I'll start, because certainly we need to do a better job of providing opportunity for students, especially students who aren't wealthy, to get great educations in STEM fields. In the IDEA Act that I mentioned earlier, we do have a fee structure that would raise money from the issuance of visas and funnel that money into education for American STEM students. When I drafted the bill, it was before Microsoft came out with its wonderful plan. And actually, Microsoft, and I want to give them credit for this, has created or proposed a much more expansive plan of fee-driven support for STEM education. So I think that has to be a part of whatever we do. But to me, we still don't want to send the people who just got their PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford back to wherever they're from. We want to keep them here because they're going to create a company and they're going to create jobs that's going to hire Americans. So it's a false dichotomy, and it's one I hear often in the immigration subcommittee from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have, I think, an incorrect view of economics. I've heard many of them say, for every immigrant who comes in, it's a job lost by an American. That really doesn't understand that our economy is dynamic, and when you start a company and you create products, you create more growth and you create more jobs. So you want to do both. You want to make sure that we nurture students in America into those fields and pay real money into scholarships for those students into STEM fields, and also capture the people who are terrific, who we don't want to go home if they're willing to stay here and become Americans with us. And just a word on whether we should focus only on the PhD recipients and the like. I'm very much for that. But when I heard Jerry Yang's name, I was thinking, he funded your company, but Jerry didn't come here because he got his degree. Jerry grew up in East San Jose, and he was here. His mother was the immigrant, and he's a brilliant guy, went to Stanford, devised Yahoo, and then started that company. So we're getting growth not just from the people that are walking across the stage getting their diplomas, but from people who have enough get up and go to get up and go and come to America. And that's why the statistics on business formation, both tech and high tech, are so high among immigrant groups overall.
Yeah, I like that point. Actually, that's very true, because the group that he has created with two other of his ex-former Yahoo partners are now American, but they not come from the old immigrants. And they're the one that gave me that chance to lead that around. It allows us to have this company being where it is today. So I totally agree with you that I think we have to get those people to come here. Imagine if Google had to leave, for example. How many employees Google is today hiring who are Americans? Imagine all those companies have been created by foreigners that came with the desire and the energy.
Sergey Brin, his parents were the immigrants, Sergey. And he's a brilliant guy. I'm sure glad that Google is in Mountain View instead of Moscow.
Yeah.
But I even have, so in my role at Universal Electronics, developing the product strategy for the company, we look at other companies, especially in Silicon Valley, to partner with to develop these technologies. And I'll take my trips to the Bay Area, and you walk around the halls of most of these startup companies, and it's really quite a mix of people, a really diverse workforce. And one company in particular that has tremendous potential for growth, their head of sales, basically, the guy who's supposed to build the revenue for the company, is unable to get a visa. So he lives in Canada, and he commutes every week to the Bay Area to support the growth of this company, but he can't get actual paperwork to be based in Silicon Valley. So just imagine this company, the struggles they're going through, already the stress of a startup, trying to grow that business, trying to make it big, and then trying to find the right talent. And they found the right talent, but they can't get status for him. So he's now commuting back and forth, a 5-hour flight every, at the beginning and the end of every week to help this company grow. And it just doesn't make sense. And that company, if it grows, obviously has the potential to employ, thousands of people down the road.
And just to echo Congressman Lofgren's point about it being a false dichotomy between education and immigration. So, I direct a national coalition focused on D.C., but I also work for New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And in New York City, we are doing everything we can to fix the STEM pipeline in schools. We're partnering with IBM to have a technology school. We're doing a school just based on programming. We have mentors we have scholarships. We're doing huge amounts in the community to try and create more STEM grads, and we're bringing in Cornell to build what we hope will be an MIT or a Caltech-like university in New York City. We're working with Columbia and NYU. And the reality is all we are doing to increase our STEM pipeline, it's not an either or, because unless we fix the immigration problem, we're just not, the pool of engineers that we're going to create in New York City, the pool of scientists we're going to create in New York City is not going to be sufficient to meet the demand to build a Silicon Valley there.
Sure, and I want to start talking about specific approaches here, but before I do, if anybody thought we were going to go an entire panel without me mentioning the fiscal cliff, you're wrong, but can't really go a week without that, right? So that being said, when we're talking so much about sequestration, mandatory cuts, big changes to federal spending and to federal programs, does it begin to ring hollow when we talk about comprehensive, holistic reform here? Can we say, we want to spend more on education when in fact we don't really know if we can spend more on education? It begins to seem as if, fixing the H-1B problem, fixing high-skilled immigration is really just a short-term patch. What do you all think about this? How is this being received, on the Hill among folks in industry? Go for it.
I didn't vote for sequestration. Sometimes the no votes you cast look better and better as time goes on. I do think, once again, there's very narrow and counterproductive thinking in some parts of the Hill where, yes, we do have a deficit problem that has to be coped with by our country. The way to cope with it is not to cut everything that will promote growth in the American economy. And that would be infrastructure, science, education. That's going to make us, that's going to grow our economy. It's going to grow revenue. And so we're having a huge fight over that whole issue. And I hope that the forces of growth in our economy will prevail. Certainly the president understands that. But I should note this, the Immigration Service doesn't get one dime of taxpayers' money. The entire system is funded by fees. And so, if we change the immigration law, we'll have to adjust the fees so the whole thing comes out even at the end. Now, that's not enforcement, and I don't know who saw the New York Times this morning. The Migration Policy Institute just did the arithmetic and is able to report that we spend more money on immigration enforcement than all other federal law enforcement combined. Really a stunning and absurd situation. So I think if we are able to create an opportunity for people to lawfully immigrate to the United States rather than, have to sneak in, the enforcement needs will go down as well. We'll have less people trying to sneak across the border to pick crops if they can get a visa to go pick crops. And so I think this is really reforming immigration is going to be a huge economic winner for the United States, and we're talking to the CBO. They're not always, they don't always look at reality, they look at just the way they add it up, but we're hopeful that we can come up with a bill that shows that this is going to be a real good deal economically for the United States.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, on the costs and benefits side, immigration reform is a budget positive thing. That enforcement will go down because there will be fewer people here illegally, and there's more revenue collected because at the end of the day, it boosts our economy. To talk about just the high skill side, every advanced degree STEM grad you keep creates 2.5 additional jobs for American workers. That's more people working, that's more people spending, that's more people paying taxes. And so while you're right, the fiscal issues we face are really scary, immigration is one of the few budget neutral or budget positive things we can do that actually to get the economy moving. So.
Sure. So let's talk about how to do it. House Republicans tried to move a bill at the end of last year that ultimately, didn't really pick up any support in the Senate. Congresswoman, I know you didn't support the legislation partly because of the way it would have handled the diversity visa, which I know was a big concern among Democrats. If they had stripped that part of the legislation, if it was, the bare bones there, do you think Democrats would have supported it? I know you favor the IDEA Act, that's your legislation. It's a holistic bill that you've been working on for a while, but would the alternative have worked out? Would it have moved anywhere?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out, in my opinion, that effort was never on the level. And people who know anything about the legislative process could easily see it wasn't on the level. The author of the bill, who was then the chairman of the committee, put together a bill that he knew could not pass by eliminating the diversity visa. And people can argue about the lottery, but the need for diversity is something that is important to the country. And to come out with an elimination with no substitute right after the November election was, unbelievable, and just designed to make sure the bill was defeated. I offered personally to sit down with the chairman to come up with alternatives, but there was never a willingness to do that. We did finally, because there was no willingness to put together a bill that could actually pass, I put in my own bill and got a number of co-sponsors. Luis Gutierrez is a fabulous person who has been one of the biggest advocates for the undocumented around our country. He was an original co-sponsor of the alternative bill that I introduced that basically would have given visas to our graduates of the top universities, the research universities in the United States. It's about 200 universities, masters and PhDs. There were some other problems with the bill. It was crafted in a very tricky way so that the 55,000 diversity visas that would be eliminated were allocated to masters and PhD. But then, rather than trickle down to other visa categories, as is ordinarily the case in immigration law, it basically threw the visas away if they weren't all used. And certainly, after working off the backlog, and reasonable people disagree on how long that would take, there aren't 55,000 master and PhD recipients receiving degrees from American research universities every year. It's about 17,000. If you assume that not every single one of them wants to stay in the United States, which I think is a reasonable assumption, you're probably looking about 12,000, demand of 12 to 15,000 a year maximum that would utilize these visas. I mean, the value to the country is immense. But to say that we're going to only provide permanent residence visas to those fabulously educated people if we can shrink immigration overall, a one-for-one reduction was just a non-starter on our side of the aisle, because if you say you can only give a visa to one person if you take it away from another, means you can't do immigration reform. I mean, when I was chairing the immigration subcommittee, we made a big effort to get consensus from diverse political areas. And one of my witnesses was Dr. Richard Land, who was then the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Land and I don't agree on many, many things, But he is a proponent of immigration reform. And I'll never forget his testimony. I always want to quote him because I don't want to steal his line. He said, you know, for many years, we had 2 signs at the border. And one of the signs said no trespassing, and the other side said help wanted. You know, people say, well, immigrants who come here ought to come in the legal way. We have 5,000 permanent residence visas a year for skilled, non-college educated applicants. We have 2 million farm workers. I mean, we set this situation up. And so we got to do something so that the 10 or 11 million people that responded to the market forces can have some way to get right with the law. If you're saying the only way to do that is to make sure that 10 million people don't get a visa, that means that Americans who married somebody from another country, that, I mean, it just will become impossible to reform the law. So that was a big problem, along with the fact that it had for-profit schools as the issuer of the visas and online universities, which I've never heard anybody in Silicon Valley tell me that they want the PhD applicants to be from fly-by-night U. So there were some problems with the bill, but it was never a serious effort in any case.
Sure. For the rest of the panel, how did the legislation play out among industry, among the folks that you guys work with? Did it seem like it was a non-starter? This was one of those things in which some folks in Silicon Valley were willing to talk, but much decided to wait and see. And there's a lot to be said about whether that approach was correct. But how did it play out?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Taking by my example, what I've gone through, for example, as a case. So when Zod Farzem and Ash Patel from that group put naturally a contingency clause in my investment round, and which is not done yet, but still saying, look, we can't invest if you're not going to be there. It was clear to me we went through the hatchery, which is a supporting lab and also an engine in the Valley that's helping to bridge the gap between the Silicon Valley and DC and try to have conversation. And we talked to a lot of congressmen and also to senators, and everyone agreed across the board that it was a no-brainer, it has to be done. So what is very strange to me and to other people that I've been talking to in Silicon Valley is why hasn't been acted upon if it's been so clear to everyone how much of an issue it is. And I know a ton of people at Stanford and across the board as well, in other universities as well, that had to leave the country and close their company because of not having those visas. So today, if you look at the status purely legally, for a person leaving university like me, want to create a company as a founder, there's no visa per se. There's none. You have H-1B, which is you need to have an employee-employee relationship. You have to have to put an enormous amount of money in if you want to be have an investment visa, or you need to be O1 category. But for being just purely an entrepreneur that has a desire to create something meaningful with legitimate amount of funding, there's nothing today. And that's what is, I think, a real problem in terms of losing talent, because those people have to leave and just can't create or have to find ways and paths. You have another visa category, allows you to be a trainee. So you have to be a founder, but you can't be a trainee because you're a founder and therefore it doesn't work. So you have all basically those hurdles and the intertwinedness of those regulations that have been created as time goes by that today don't fit the economy and the need, I think, for those talent to come and to create value.
You're absolutely right that we need to reform the law, so if you start a company, you can get a permanent residence visa based on starting that company and creating jobs. However, while we're working on that, and I hope that if all goes right, we should be able to come together in the next 6 to 8 months, I would hope, so, yeah, and finish this. But meanwhile, the USCIS, that administers law, is trying to make changes so this works, the current system is administered better. And one of the changes we've made is if you have an H-1B, you actually can be president of your company. Really? And that was something that I worked with the director of Mayorkas about. We're trying to make it easier for outstanding people to get their O visas even though they haven't published. The old system is too heavily weighted to publication, and it ends up excluding young people who are geniuses, who are technologists. And so there's a new effort underway in the agency to reform that and to make sure that it works more easily. The director has formed sort of an advisory group, Entrepreneurs in Residence, to try and give him feedback. And I really think, although the agency is not perfect, the director is working very hard to try and make this work. And it's a gigantic bureaucracy. It's not easy to translate an idea into change in every single office in the agency. But let me just invite people who are having problems to contact not only him, but certainly myself, because we want this to work while we're working for reform of the legal system. And we're often able to sort through problems because sometimes snags occur and they're not really what should happen.
And I think that what you're saying, Congresswoman, is that exactly it's not been translated all the way. I mean, I got my own one probably thanks to you, and now I realize it. But it's exactly what you're saying. I think there's a real intent at a strategic level, but to translate that on every level from every prosecutor is a different story. And if we can help in any way, I would love to be able to do that.
Sure. So where do we start from here? You know, we tend to have these conversations. We talk about how great high-skilled immigration is, and then very quickly we fall back into ideological trenches, and then nothing gets done. So as we get going in the 113th Congress, as we kind of look back at this with some fresh eyes, where do we start that has the potential for going somewhere? Do we look at the H-1B? Do we take a step back and look at more specialized visa like the L-1? What do we do here to create the foundation for something meaningful to move?
I mean, I think it's good to have an ideological vision of what full comprehensive immigration reform looks like, and I think it's a very valuable effort to work towards that. But I do think there has to be a parallel path to fix the short term. I mean, when we have companies, tech companies that are starving for talent, we have agricultural operations that are starving for talent, that, you know, we're in this delicate economic phase where we're just sort of starting to bump along, starting to get going. We should do everything we can to lubricate that so that it gets moving, so we do have a strong economy. Because with a strong economy, lots of things happen. Lots of things happen automatically. A lot of discussions become a lot easier. And I think if we're hampering the success of companies because of immigration issues, the success of agricultural operations because of immigration issues, I think we need a short-term solution as well as a more comprehensive long-term solution.
Sure, but wouldn't the short-term solution detract from the ability to do long-term? I mean, this is the argument that some Democrats are making. We know that, you know, on practically any tech issue that we've tried to move through Congress over the past year, it's been hard to do dual-track efforts. So, I mean, if you don't think that that's the way to do it, if we should do two-track, what do we start with? Where do we actually start so that we can get something meaningful to move?
I mean, the U.S. has always been a land of immigrants. I mean, it has been right from the beginning, and people always came here looking for opportunity. And the type of opportunities that were available in the U.S. in older times were really, you know, factory jobs, kind of more unskilled jobs, and so it almost seems like the system is a little bit skewed towards that, and there's less room for, let's say, there's less allotments for educated visas. So I think for the short term, without upsetting things too much, is there a way to increase the allotment of the
Actually,
skilled?
what you're saying is just not correct. There are 5,000 visas for skilled without a college education legal permanent residents. There are many more for college educated. On the temporary visa side, there are many more H-1B visas than H-2B visas. So it's actually much harder to come in a non-tech necessary worker position than in a tech worker position. I would just counsel this. You know, I was on the phone yesterday with somebody who was saying, well, we should move an ag worker provision ahead of everything else because farmers are plowing under their crops because they can't get workers. And then I've got tech people, and that's my district and my home, that we have to move the tech thing and only that because we've got a problem. And then you've got crab shuckers in Maryland saying, the crab season is over because we can't get the crab shuckers. We have a window here where we can actually get the whole thing done because of the political situation that occurred in November. If the people who see just their part of it, and their part of it's legit, and I don't expect the CEO of a technology company to have the same passion for the tomato picker as he does for the engineer, but if we can't take a broader view, we may lose this opportunity. And I think that would be a very serious mistake for the country. If we can't come together and do the whole thing within the next year, we'll be back to where we are, trying to, each man for himself, trying to crawl over the other guy. But I'll tell you, I've been down that road many times, and when you try and move something in the tech world, then you got the ag world, and you've got this, and it's why not me? And let's do it together. I think we have a chance to do that now.
And I'd agree with that, but respectfully push back on a little bit of it, which is to say, you're right. People need to work together because the constituencies are very dispersed and people have a lot of different interests. And we do have an amazing window with the demographic change and with the election. My fear, though I think our position as a Partnership for a New American Economy is we have to go as big as we can and we have to push for the big reform. My fear is that what happened in 2006, 2007, where you get very close to getting everything and walk away with nothing. And so I think the importance when you're having this debate is you need to go as far as you can to get a deal. Yep. And if it turns out that you can't get to 60 votes on a big comprehensive immigration reform, then I think it's important to have that fight to get as close as you can and then figure out what gets you to 60 votes. Because there certainly are a lot of things that are close.
If the Democrats in the Senate do not succeed in filibuster reform, I retract everything I've said. Because, when one person can stop everything, you can't move. I am assuming that Senator Reid is going to be successful in some reform efforts. And if that's the case, then I think we have an opportunity, not because I'm so wonderful, it's because the Republicans are not going to elect another Republican president unless they do something about this. So it's their decision. If they want to keep doing what they've been doing, they can. I can't stop them. If they want to stop smashing their head against that wall, I'm going to work with them. And I know how to do deals. I mean, it can't just be the way I want it. We can work together, craft something that's workable. I'm confident of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you asked earlier about what our view of the STEM fight was. And our view of the STEM fight was it was Congressman Lofgren and Senator Schumer working around the clock to reach a deal with Congressman Smith and putting in an incredibly valiant effort. And when the first bill came out in late summer, I mean, as a coalition, we wanted a bipartisan effort. So our position on the bill was we want something that will pass, and that wasn't the bill that was going to pass. And I think that there needs to be real bipartisan reform, and that takes people getting up and forcing people to compromise. And I think one thing that's very promising, if you look in this room, there were earlier representatives I saw of Senator Lee's office from Utah. Senator Lee is sort of a new voice on this and is going to be a leader on this, and there are now leaders from both sides looking to compromise, but the problem is that to get to 60 votes, we're not even talking about the House yet, but to get to 60 votes requires a lot of difficult votes that just aren't there yet.
Sure. Jump in.
I just have a quick point. My point is I'm not from Congress, I'm not an American, non-American immigrant. How can we help? How can we put some force and a weight behind it? Because from the Silicon Valley angle, but I agree with everyone across the board, this is important. And if it's important for me, it's important for other industries as well. And it affects them probably in the same manner, just in different form. How can we have an impact on that regulation to make that sure that it's happened this year? I think that's what I would like to learn about.
Sure. So I want to turn to audience questions in a second, so prepare them if you have them. But I also want to go back to my original question, which is where do we start, right? We've established the politics are particularly thorny. It's going to be difficult no matter what we put together, to get it through the House or the Senate. So where do you guys think we need to start on specific issues that eventually results in the sort of compromise, the sort of potentially comprehensive package that you all seem to be looking for?
I mean, go ahead, I'm sorry.
This isn't very tough, really. Without getting into the details, there are just certain elements that have to be part of a plan. You have to be able to control your borders, and since we're spending more on immigration enforcement than we are on the FBI, DEA, ATF combined, I think we can make a claim that we're making substantial efforts in that regard. You have to put in place a mechanism to enforce a workable system. You have to have some way for the 10 or 11 million people who respond to the help wanted sign at the border to get right with the law in some way. You need to have a provision to meet the economic needs of the United States prospectively, and that would include the technology sector, the ag sector, and other sectors of the economy that need immigrant workers to grow the economy. And you need to do something about helping families avoid useless and lengthy separations because of the visa system. That's all you need to do.
I think that's absolutely right. But and the question I think to the audience is what can people do? And the role I think that people are saying, we want compromise, we want this to happen. I mean, if you look at 06, 07, what people say about why it didn't happen, one of the things was, well, the opponents were burning up our phone lines. They were shutting down the switchboard because they were out caring about it, and people who wanted immigration reform were nowhere to be heard from. That's part of the reason we exist as a coalition. I mean, it's one of the driving reasons we exist as a coalition. But what can we do? We can be out writing op-eds. We can be meeting with your senators. You can be getting people, recruiting others to speak out on the issue, to tell the story. I mean, stories move the debate. So you can be telling your immigration story that you can then go to the news and say, here's the reality of the system. The face of it isn't just people coming here illegally, though that's part of it. It's also people coming here to start jobs. And it's in every sector of the economy. And it's not just tech, it's not just agriculture. And when people get out and have that countervailing force of saying, we want this, we want to talk about it, we want it to happen now, that's when you're going to get to the votes you need to pass it.
Sure, so let's turn over to audience questions. I think we have a mic going around, so anybody? I'm going to remember this the next time one of you guys calls to complain about something I wrote. But any audience questions at all? Well, Ralph in the front.
Hi, thank you. It's Ralph Hellman. We've had this, you've said that we got to do this comprehensive and take all the undocumented aliens, illegal alien side, and put it over here for a second and just deal with legal immigration. We're in a box, and I think you described it, Congresswoman, that we take roughly 1 million legal immigrants in, and what the Republicans have said is, if you want to increase it in one category, high skilled or anything else, you have to take it from another category, and they pick diversity lottery. How do we break out of that box? Given that they'll say, hey, listen, there's 7.8% unemployment, why are we increasing legal immigration? We're taking enough. How do we make the case that, no, that it's good for the economy, we need more than 1 million, and don't put us in a spot where we have to support a decrease in one form of legal immigration in order to increase it in another?
This is simply a decision that the Republican leadership needs to make in the House and Senate. That's all it is. I mean, we have the analysis. We know that immigration does not decrease employment. I mean, and we have stacks of studies and analysis to prove that. Going to the 10 million, they're already here. They're already working. So, I mean, it's not as if, if we say you can get right with the law, you're going to come here, you're here. I know that we can come together and substantively do a bill that will work. The question is, does the Republican leadership and the House and Senate want to put this issue behind them for the good of their party or not? And that's a difficult decision for them, because in the House, we've got members that run by districts. And not every district really, members aren't going to lose their elections in their own districts, but their standard bearer for the Republican standard bearer for president is going to lose every 4 years unless they're able to resolve this. So I'm actually hopeful. Mr. Boehner has said that he thinks it's time for comprehensive reform. Here's the good news. Democrats are winning in those demographic groups because of this problem that the Republicans have. We're willing to let that go. We're actually willing to work together collaboratively. We'll compete on other issues, honestly. And I think that if we do that collaboratively, we can come to a solution, but it's only a decision that needs to be made by the Republican leadership.
And the STEM bill is a pretty good case for that. So the STEM bill went up twice over the last year. It went up in late summer on something called the suspension calendar, and it lost, and then it went up after the election by rule, and it passed. And there was one real difference in the bill, and the one real difference in the bill is they added something called a V visa, which would reunite about 100,000 families. And well, why did they add that? Well, they added it because of the election. And so the answer is, like, what you can do to break out of the box is more things like this election, more things like people speaking up and making the case that both parties need to get on the right side of this issue. And so, I mean, that was a very small step forward and not enough to get the reform that I think people think is coming. but that was a very big change in a very small, well.
Sure. I want to go back to audience questions in a second, but to follow up with you, Congresswoman, what does the Obama administration have to do to ensure we don't get stuck in that box, as we just talked about? I mean, do they need to come forward with legislative proposals? Do they need to leave it to Congress, considering the ways that things have gone over the course of the last couple months? I mean, what's the role they have to play to make it work?
I think the president very clearly wants immigration reform to occur. He's in a difficult spot because if he introduces a bill, it could make it more difficult for Republicans to move forward, weirdly enough. If he doesn't introduce a bill, Republicans will say, well, he hasn't provided leadership. So he's got a difficult problem, and what I'm hoping is that we can get a signal soon, publicly, from the Republican leadership that they want to proceed. And that, if that signal could come promptly, I think that would be the single most important measure that would allow us to move forward. The president, if we have a comprehensive bill, he's going to sign the bill. So that's not going to be a problem. The problem is coming together and really having the Republican leadership say, we want to get this behind us. And I think if they say that, we can get this done.
Other questions from the audience? Right in the back. I think this is the last question we've got time for, so you get to close this out, Larry.
Hi, Larry Downs. Several of you have hinted at this, but I wonder if you could be more explicit. Who are the organized interests against immigration reform? You know, can you name them, and can you tell us what would be their most reasonable argument against all this reasonable stuff you've been talking about?
I will say this quickly. When you set this up as proponents versus opponents, it assumes that they are groups of equal footing. The opponents of immigration reform, especially when you talk about high-skilled, is an extremely small and marginalized minority. Now, they're very vocal, and they're very, very good at burning up phone lines. So the groups are groups like FAIR and Numbers USA and Center for Immigration Studies. I mean, there are groups that do dedicate to this, and their arguments against it, they will say things like, well, why would you give an immigrant a job if an American can't have one? Or they'll find, for a high skill, they'll find someone like a scientist or an engineer, an American-born scientist or engineer, who can't find a job. And of course that's true, because there's never going to be zero employment. We work in a world where the most we can hope for is something called full employment, which varies. Most people say it's around 4%. If you look at unemployment for Americans in STEM, for PhDs, it's 3.15%. For masters, it's 3.4%. There is full employment. There's more than full employment, plus there's a labor shortage. And if you look at where there are a lot of foreigners in STEM, it doesn't correlate at all to where there's higher unemployment among U.S. born. So, I mean, those are their arguments. Their arguments are about why there's a recession, there's 8% unemployment, why would you give a job to an immigrant? And they're arguments that work really well in a bumper sticker and not so well in when you talk about economics.
I just would like to add, I mean, FAIR and Numbers USA have extreme views, and their position is that immigration ought to be drastically reduced, even if it means that the spouses of American citizens have to go live in some other country. I mean, they have very extreme views. There is another group that has expressed concern about immigration, and that's American engineers and also labor unions. And the concern is about wages and also a lack of bargaining power. And the way I think to resolve that issue is to examine the arguments to heavily weight immigration towards legal permanent residence rather than temporary visas, so that individuals have bargaining power. And one of the things that in my IDEA Act I took a look at was the complaint that I hear at home that H-1B visa holders are being paid less than the people sitting next to them in companies. And when you look at the Department of Labor MSA annual for my area, level 1 wages under the Department of Labor is $86,736 for computer and information, research computer and information scientists, just for example. The median income, however, is $133,000. So there is some validity to the argument that's been made, and the way to deal with that is, I think, to adjust this so that you don't require companies to underpay people, and listen to the people who are actually in the workplace seeing what they're actually seeing. The bill that we put together on the IDEA Act has protections for H-1B visa holders, which is only appropriate, and reforms the labor certification process, which is also appropriate. It has the support of industry and also the IEEE. So it's possible to put these things together and make them work.
Sure, thank you, Congresswoman. And we're going to leave it on that note. I just want to extend one more thank you to everyone here on the panel. Thanks so much for the conversation. And thanks all of you guys for staying. There's going to be plenty more conversation here, and I'm sure we're going to stick around. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.